Grievous wounds, shouted taunts, and acrobatic maneuvers can all turn the tide of battle in the world of myth. Hi, my name is Ross Watson. I'm the lead designer for Myth Tales of Legend.
And I'm J.M. Defoe, and I'm the lead writer for Myth Tales of Legend.
We hope you guys are all doing safe out there. We value our fans.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be, today's episode is all about combat, the third part in a series that we've been doing for Myth Tales of Legend. Today we're going to cover quite a bit of stuff, right, JM?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to covering the interaction attacks. Those are some of my favorite mechanics in the game, so I'm really looking forward to kind of getting into that.
What are interaction attacks?
Well, interaction attacks are ways to impose conditions on your enemies that isn't just damage. So they'll use skills like athletics, deception, intimidate, or persuasion to maneuver or force your opponent into a more vulnerable or disadvantageous state.
That's right. So to use an interaction attack, it is a combat action where you use one of those skills, athletics, deception, intimidation, or persuasion, and you roll against a difficulty number of the opponent on their same skill or their resolve trait, whichever is higher. Now, if you pass, if you pass the test, you can impose one of two conditions on them. What are those conditions?
Hindered and vulnerable.
Right, and can you explain those?
Sure. Let me pull up my additional notes. So hindered increases the difficulty number of everything they're trying to do. You've basically made it harder for them to focus, harder for them to act. So it requires an additional success essentially for them to get their action to succeed. If they are vulnerable, however, you've made it easier for everyone else at the table to attack that person. Their defense decreases by 1 to a minimum of 1. So you can't drop them to 0. But the other thing to remember is this is not just for heroes. GMs, you can be using interaction attacks to get that monk into position where so that your unholy can actually hurt them. I don't speak from experience, but there's a little bit of experience there from the playtest.
Right, and there's a further condition you can put on somebody if you can get 4 or more shifts over your target.
Mm-hmm. And that one's called Player's Call. Do you want to?
Right. Well, Player's Call is kind of the one where the GM really needs to kind of sit in the driver's seat, because on Player's Call you can kind of say, I want this to happen, and the Game Master says yay or nay. Now, most of the time, Player's Call is for circumstances where you're like, I want to intimidate him so badly that he just spends the rest of the round wondering what to do, right? And the minimum result of a Player's Call is that the enemy loses a turn. However, you can also say, I want to maneuver the bad guy over the cliff, right? Now, that's a far more important use of something like Player's Call. And the Game Master is usually going to be the one who says yay or nay. And, it's going to depend on the circumstances and various other things. Like if you're, 4 feet tall and you're trying to push something 12 feet tall over a cliff, maybe not.
Right.
It's going to depend. So, but those are things that really can happen during an interaction attack. And Player's Call is kind of the most interesting of what's already a fairly creative and interesting tactic to use in combat.
Right, and the condition that you were going for still applies. So it's Player's Call, but they also still may be vulnerable or hindered. I do feel like I wore the appropriate shirt for this.
Yes.
You reach to push the orc off the cliff, but you roll a natural 1.
Yes. And this, of course, was inspired by Torg. And in a recent Torg game, actually, I had a character who wanted to perform a maneuver, I ended up getting a Player's Call because I rolled so well.
Yeah.
And JM was the GM in that case. So, yeah, there's definitely times where you as a player can be like, I want to do this. And in my case, my Player's Call was to trap the villain's arm.
Right. That was awesome.
Literally couldn't move that arm. So they were not only vulnerable, but they also just looked like they were stuck.
Right.
So that's how interaction attacks work, and they're really a great way if you play a face character and you're like, I want to have an impact on this battle without having to shoot. you can do that.
Right. Or if you're playing the this sort of helps replicate a lot of those action scenes that we love in movies that, you know, and that may be more difficult to pull off in other games, right? Where, you know, where Ross and I want to take the rope and run and knock people over with the rope stretched between us, or wrap it around the giant's legs in hopes that he falls over. Well, we have a game mechanic that supports this sort of action-focused, more than just I swing my sword. Now, Absolutely. Ross, I have a question for you.
Yes,
it is an action attack. So if they describe their interaction attack very well, could they get the narrative bonus dice?
You know, I definitely could see that. Yes. Again, this is all up to the GM, so you know, be very cognizant of that. I think the intention is for the narrative bonus dice to apply to your standard swings and shots. But if it was a particularly awesome description, I might go for it.
Cool.
So yeah, and even we have some of our archetypes are really good at interaction attacks, like the Scald has a ability that's very similar to an interaction attack, for example. But yeah, moving on. Swashbucklers also are going to get they're going to get a lot of value out of athletics.
They really are.
But moving on. So we are going to talk about combat complications next.
Yes.
And what is we've talked about critical hits, right? In one of our previous videos, probably the first video.
I think the first combat video we talked about that.
Yeah, first combat video. So the complication is when you roll a 1 on the Campfire die instead of a 6, and this creates a complication. So JM, what is a complication?
So a complication would be in some ways it's like a fumble. So it's when you roll a 1 on the Campfire die. Now, in some ways it's independent of the result, right? You could have a success, like you could succeed, but still have a complication. If you fail and get a complication, that's where we get into what may be termed as a fumble or a critical miss. But so we are going to have a chart that you can roll on if you can't think of something. But some great examples are, hey, you hit and maybe you drop your weapon, or you miss and you drop your weapon, or you fall prone. Or I think of one of my favorite parts of Rollmaster was all of the critical miss tables, and you know, you worst move ever. You pull a hamstring and everyone laughs at you for the round. I might pull that one into this.
Well, the intention of complication is to work with the GM and come up with something interesting and cool, but not everybody can think of that right out in the moment. And combat is particularly like time sensitive, right? So yeah, we have included a chart of things that you can just roll and say, okay, this happens, and then move on to the next thing.
Right.
My favorite, and probably my player's least favorite, is the accidentally hitting a target other than the one you aimed at.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Right. So many. I've had a lot of great memorable scenes where somebody accidentally hit one of their friends, or hits the chandelier's rope, or just hit something like, oh God,
yeah,
what did I just do?
I didn't mean to do that, but it adds a little bit of chaos to the game, and I like that. And I also like that it only comes up on one specific die. It's not something that happens a lot, but it's still statistically and narratively significant, but it's not something that you're going to be worried about every time you throw the dice.
Right. And okay, so here's a funny anecdote. For my sport, I like to throw axes. Okay. And I have seen a number of times where I, in real life, have rolled a complication and gone, oh God, like what did I just hit with that axe? Or the axe gets stuck in the target. And every time this happens, I'm thinking this is probably what a complication would look like.
I just rolled a 1 on my Campfire die.
Exactly, and yeah, you feel that like, oh God, like a couple of times when you miss the target, or in my case, I've thrown completely over the target. But yeah, let's move on to damage.
All right.
So we talked about in Combat 2, Video 2, we talked about attacking and how you attack things. Now let's talk about how you damage things. Pretty simple, really. your attack, a successful attack has what's called the damage value,
Mm-hmm.
and your total damage value equals the base damage of your attack plus any successes you may have rolled on your extra damage dice. Then you compare that total damage value to the target's fortitude. Any damage value over that number is how much vitality you inflict, or is inflicted against you. So what happens when you get to 0?
So when you get to 0, you're unconscious as a hero. Unnamed NPCs are usually killed, or at the scenario and narrative discretion may also be knocked unconscious depending on what you're going for. We do have sort of a massive damage rule where if a single attack exceeds double your total vitality. So this is a fairly rare occurrence, but can still happen. You are just outright dead. You do not pass go directly to the underworld.
So from a game design perspective, honestly, I believe it's important to have a rule that says there is a point at which you are just dead. And I mean, it's very rare. We're talking about edge case upon edge case upon edge case. But if you as the DM are like in a situation where a player says, I'm going to run underneath that avalanche, even though there's a giant boulder coming my way, and try and pull the thing out, there has to be a consequence for that kind of thing, right? And I think that this rule is kind of that GM going, okay, well, sure, but that is an attack that will do double your vitality, so you'd better not be there when it gets there.
I like that because it also allows you as the GM to, we all get caught up in the moment sometimes, and we're like, well, I'm going to go do this, and we may not have thought all the way through there, and it allows the GM to go, all right, but if you do this, there's a really good chance that it's going to kill you. Oh, okay. I hadn't considered that fact. Right. It's not like we're playing Call of Cthulhu and it's like anything could kill you at any moment, and that's just sort of the way we're playing the game. Myth is a game that has heroes, right? So I like that rule.
Now, named NPCs, like if you're fighting Zargoth the Destroyer, right? He is either dead or unconscious at 0 vitality, depending on the circumstances. If you as a GM are like, you hit him and he stumbles and goes over that cliff, and the body tumbles down beneath the clouds, and you're like, I wonder what happened to him. He might not be dead.
He might just be unconscious.
Right. But most of the time, like in general circumstances, named and unnamed NPCs are dead at 0 vitality. The narrative kind of is where this kind of the game master has a little discretion to say that guy's not quite dead.
Now there are ways to sort of soak damage, and if you take a massive hit, to sort of reduce it.
Yes. So soaking. Named NPCs like Zargoth the Destroyer and heroes like JM's own character, they can roll their soak stat. And if they do that, they convert any successes they roll on that die roll, convert 1 vitality damage into 1 shock damage. You can't do this forever, and it costs you 1 soak just to try. But it does allow you or a named NPC to take a few hits that might otherwise be fatal.
Right.
Now, what's mortal vitality?
So mortal vitality, there are things in the game that you just can't soak. Mortal vitality, it always applies directly to your character's vitality, regardless of your fortitude. So
it's just damage.
It's just damage.
Damage. Yeah.
Right. You fall into a forge.
Yeah.
I don't care how tough you are. Unless you're a Spriggan, in which case you may take more damage. But, right, there are just some things that are that overwhelming, irresistible force that it doesn't matter how tough you are. If you get hit, you're taking damage.
Suffocation is a good example of something like this as well. Yeah. And some spells or special abilities, although those are very, very,
very rare. Yeah.
And then, so let's say you have taken some damage. And you soaked it, but you still have damage. There is an effect called heavily wounded that can come into play. When does heavily wounded come into play?
So if you've taken more than half your vitality, you're heavily wounded. You take +2 DN to all tests. So this is sort of to kind of go meta for a bit, this is the difference between vitality and, say, hit points, right? Vitality actually represents wounds that you are taking and exhaustion that is setting in, and when you've taken more than half, you are at a penalty. It is not like you are as fully capable at 30 vitality as you are at 1 vitality. No, at 15, things start getting a little harder, and it may put into the players' minds, hey, we're all heavily wounded. Maybe we need to stop thinking about winning this fight, and maybe we need to start thinking about running from this fight.
Some monsters do have abilities that come into play when they are heavily wounded, but this is, again, not very common.
Yeah. Or when you're heavily wounded.
Or when you are heavily wounded. Yeah, there's yes. They're uncommon, but this is a thing that may come into play where the game master goes, "Oh, you're heavily wounded," or "He's heavily wounded," and that means this ability is now active.
Yeah.
But that's basically how damage works. Now, let's say I have Zargoth the Destroyer climb back up the cliff and attack JM's character and deals a crap load of damage, and JM is now at 0 vitality. Well, we know he's unconscious.
Right.
What happens next?
So it is not a strict, hey, at 0, you're either unconscious or you're dead. You are in danger of dying when you're at 0. There's always this chance that when you hit 0, things have gone from dangerous to mortal. You can't soak, you can't do anything. You have to make what are called Defiance checks at the start of your turn. Now, a Defiance check is just a simple D6 roll. 4+ you pass, 1 to 3 you fail, and a 1 counts as 2 failures. So on a 4+ you pass. If you roll a 6, you immediately gain a vitality and become conscious again. If you fail 1 or more Defiance checks in a single scene, you gain a scar. Right? There's something. That wound was so massive. Something. Some sort of memorable injury has happened. If you pass 3 Defiance checks, you stabilize. So really, that's a 4 or 5 because a 6 brings you back. If you fail 3, that's it. You're out. And so
you're dead.
Yeah, you're gone. And yeah, it's a pretty simple and elegant mechanic for the of something that we're saying in the broader RPG world, but kind of tied right into the way Myth does things. So I like Defiance checks.
I have had a character fail Defiance checks. I think my favorite is when you're actually at 2 passes and 2 fails. I had that moment happen to me, and I was like the next die roll was going to determine what happens.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that a 6 can always cause you to spring back up, and a 1 can always count as 2 failures. I mean, 1 failure, I would start sweating because I know there's a 1 in 6 chance that that's it. This roll is what ends my character.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's really nothing you can do. I mean, Defiance checks are pretty much Defiance checks. That's it. You make that roll and it's over. But there are a number of other things we can talk about. I think briefly we'll just mention there is another type of damage called shock damage. Mm-hmm. Shock damage is essentially damage that affects your determination. It's damage that affects your kind of energy. When you reach 0 shock, you are what's called exhausted. And exhausted is very bad. Exhausted means you can only you move at half speed. You can only take 1 action a turn, and there's no combat options or multi attacks or anything. You're just I'm too weak and it can help me, right? And you're in bad shape. Plus, any further shock when you're at 0 shock becomes mortal vitality. So, yeah. Shock is a resource you want to not run out of.
Right, but it does help you mitigate more. It helps you mitigate physical wounds. It comes into play. Tell me if I'm remembering this correctly. Do you take shock if the damage equals your fortitude?
Yeah, if you take damage that equals but does not exceed,
right, you
suffer a D3 shock. You also suffer shock when you roll a complication while attempting to cast a spell. Mm-hmm. Basically, this is like the feedback. Ow! I didn't quite get that spell right, and you will take some shock damage. And then there's some abilities and spells that will just straight up inflict shock. So yeah, it is a separate kind of way to handle damage. Now, unnamed NPCs at Zero Shock are just dead.
Right. They've just exhausted themselves to the point that they,
they are no longer a thing anymore. They are just gone. You can use campfire points to restore shock,
and there are some
action to do that.
Abilities that help you restore shock sort of in the middle of things.
Right. That is also a thing as well. And let's see. Lastly, we have some conditions. There's a number of conditions that can affect people in the game. I'm just going to list them because they're fairly self-evident.
Right.
Bleeding, blinded, burning, exhausted, which we already talked about, hindered, which we've already talked about, poisoned, prone, restrained, staggered, vulnerable, and then there's, of course, fear. And fear is a ability that essentially goes against your resolve trait. And if you are, you will have to make a resolve test based on a difficulty number for the thing that is causing the fear. If you pass, you're fine. If you fail, you will suffer a penalty and can't move any closer to the thing that's causing it. That pretty much wraps us up, I think, on combat, with one final thing, which is respites.
Yes.
JM, there's two kinds of respites. What are they?
Well, we have, hold on, I want to make sure I get this correct. You have short and long respites. A short one is about an hour. You can tend injuries, you can shake off trauma, restore your shock. When you complete one, you restore all of your shock. So again, shock is one of those resources that comes back a lot faster than vitality. Now, you can also, is it one character only can make a?
You can actually, any character can try, but they only get one chance.
Right. So you get one chance to sort of heal people. So you can't be like, Ross is down the most, we're all going to make heal checks on him.
Yeah, that's not gonna work.
But again, you can only do that once per short rest, and it's only a D3 plus 1, right? It's not a large amount.
No. Now then, there's the long respite is where you get all your vitality back, but this is an 8-hour rest, and you're pretty much just kind of down for the night. You have like up to 2 hours worth of light activities, eating, talking, maintaining your gear, standing watch, that kind of stuff. But that's pretty much it. Yeah. And that brings us, we made it to the end of combat. Hooray!
3 videos?
It took 3 videos.
I hope that at the end of this, having watched all 3 of these, you come away with an idea that there's a lot of flexibility in this combat system. And it sort of reinforces kind of our base goals of Myth, which is it's about the narrative and telling stories. And so you have a lot of options, both as the GM as the player, to tell and craft cool narratives. It's not just I swing my sword again. There's a lot more going on in a Myth combat.
Yeah, check out our video number 1 for combat to hear about the narrative bonus you can get, which I'm a fan of.
Yeah, I am as well.
And yeah, we've, basically combat is a part of a role-playing game, but it is not the only part of a role-playing game. It's just one of the 3 main pillars of the game. The other 2 being, social interaction and investigation, or adventuring. I think there's a big term for it. Yeah. But yeah. And Myth is a game that we like combat. It's cool, but we want to also focus on those other pillars a lot and bring in as much narrative and your character story into the scene as possible. So yeah, just if you're curious, of course, go check out those first 2 videos. This week, Ulysses has launched a Kickstarter for Tharkold.
Yes,
the new setting for Torg Eternity, cyber demons, nuclear wastelands. It is pretty awesome.
It is.
Definitely go check that out on Game On. Is it Game On Tabletop?
GameOnTabletop.com. Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. I've had the sort of the privilege of looking at the manuscript of it, because the studio game that we will get back to here hopefully sooner rather than later is set in Tharkold. And actually a lot of the stuff that we're heading into with the 4 Horsemen has to deal with Tharkold. So
Yeah, Cyber Demons, JM Cyber Demons have already been pretty terrific. So there's that. By the way, check out the Torg Eternity game, The Four Horsemen, that JM runs on the Ulysses channel. I'm playing in it. It is super fun.
It's a lot of fun.
There's also the Ulysses Worlds show, which kind of covers different creators and things that are happening in the Ulysses line.
I was actually on one.
Featured. Yeah. Very recently, JM was featured. It's a great show. I'm also featured. It's just pretty much anybody you want to know that does things at Ulysses, they're probably on that show at some point. I wouldn't be surprised if we got Robert Kuzland, the Dark Eye guy, on there.
Oh, that'd be cool.
So,
that'd be really cool.
I think it's very likely. But then just that's basically just go check out our other shows. And by the way, if you want to hear us discuss anything specifically about the rules or about the lore from Myth Tales Legend, please make a note in the comments. We read all of those, and we will be happy to discuss or answer your questions or kind of get into the things that you guys want to see.
100%. Yeah.
So thank you very much for sticking with us through combat parts 1 to 3. And until next time,
keep telling stories.